My name's Ed Septimus, and I have the privilege of chairing adult ed and coordinating this program. And for myself and Steve Tamber, my co-chair, and the adult ed committee, thank you for coming this evening. Still can't hear me? Better? Okay. I got it. Okay. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you about some upcoming programs that will occur this Thursday evening. We're going to open at the Margolis Gallery a wonderful display called Holy Sparks, and it's celebrating 50 years of women in the rabbinate, and we're going to feature and honor our own rabbi, Rabbi Scott. It starts at 6:30. I've actually seen the exhibit. It's a wonderful exhibit, and I hope many of you will come at 6:30 this Thursday. Now, next Tuesday evening, same time, almost as famous as this panel, we have the Wolf Tuman Distinguished Lecture Series, and the lecture will be a famous John Meacham. I think that's something you don't want to miss. It's at 7 p.m. You can register online. And if that's not enough, at the beginning of November 9th, in honor of the 85th, or in memory of the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, we have Rabbi Jack Romberg, who is the author of A Doorway to Heroism, the true story about Rabbi Romberg's great uncle, who was a decorated German Jewish soldier who became an American hero. Those of you who've been through our Kristallnacht lectures, you know how good they are, so I hope that you'll show up, okay? Okay, what about tonight? Tonight we're calling Sacred Aging, a celebration of life. Now, in a New York Times editorial earlier this month, the question was, can America age gracefully? They illustrate how the increasing number of older adults in our country will affect everyone, regardless of age, which is why we offered and wanted children to come as well. The demographic change will affect every part of our society. Already there are more people dying than are being born, even as more Americans are living into their 80s and 90s and beyond. In 2020, the census said that people over age 65 and older was 17%, and by 2034, get this, there'll be more Americans past retirement age than there'll be children. We're going to become the predominant group. In fact, American Jews actually are aging in greater numbers than a general U.S. population. The baby boomer generation represents now 35%, so double the general population. Now, the reason I felt so passionate about this symposium is that most people don't like to think about growing old. Death is like birth. You know it's coming, but the timing can be unpredictable. The challenge of an aging population, as you know, are deeply personal. Among the most elemental questions are where and how will we spend the closing years of our life. Millions of Americans are already grappling with these dilemmas for themselves and for their loved ones, and Americans of every generation owe it to themselves and their families to begin to answer some of these questions, which we hope we'll do tonight. In a study of, it just passed a little after 2000, showed that people with positive beliefs about getting older live 7.5 times longer than those who felt negatively about it. And that researchers found that having a positive mindset towards aging is associated with lower blood pressure, longer and healthier lives, and reduced risk of developing dementia. Now, part of that may be they show that some people who have more positive perceptions of aging are more likely to take preventive health measures, exercising, and eating better. So tonight we hope to address some of these questions and provide you with resources that are common sense and compassionate. Now, you may ask the question, why did we name this symposium Sacred Aging and a Celebration of Life? Well, we define sacred aging to the idea that the process of growing older should be meaningful and full and part of our transformative journey. It's not limited to any specific religion. Rather, we take a holistic approach to aging that recognizes the spiritual dimension of every stage of our life and encourages each of us to embrace aging as really an opportunity for growth and for fostering a sense of fulfillment and well-being in later life. And that's really the focus of tonight's discussion. And of course, we say celebration of life because it encourages all of us every day I wake up. It's an opportunity for growth, connection, and celebration, and trying to make a difference in the world. And the older generation has lots of wisdom and lots of experience to give back. And that's, I think, very, very special. So we're going to explore this with our panel and more. We'll try to discuss, and we may not get to all these topics: purpose and meaning, connection and community, legacy and wisdom. Yes, we will talk about end-of-life preparations. We'll talk about intimacy and how that changes with age. So with that as an introduction, I want to introduce an incredible all-star panel. First, Dr. Tom Cole. Tom, you raise your hand, everything knows him. I'm making a plug for his book, okay? Old Man Country, where he interviews a number of people who are over age 80. I found it to be really interesting. He's currently the director of the Center of Spiritual Direction here at Congregation Beth Israel, but he is, I guess, the emeritus position and the McGovern Center of Humanities and Ethics at the University of Texas Health Science Center. So we are delighted to have Dr. Cole with us. We have someone that most of you probably know, Dr. Rabbi Adrienne Scott, in the middle there. She, of course, is our senior associate rabbi here at Congregation Beth Israel. She chairs the inclusion committee, and I can tell you, having known Rabbi Scott since she was a rabbinic student, just a couple of years ago, right? Okay? That she is passionate about pastoral care and how important our clergy is in some of these issues. We have Dr. Amir Halevi, who currently is an attorney at Jordan Lynch. He was formerly a professor of internal medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, and he co-chaired the Medical Futility Committee, in the early 1990s? 93, and published in JAMA in 1993, and my wife, who's here, was actually on that committee as well, co-chaired with Baruch Bodie, and knows so much about this area in terms of bioethics. And then last but not least, Dr. Michael Wohner, who really serves multiple purposes tonight. Mike is a primary care physician. He also is a hospitalist and is in charge of the inpatient service at Memorial Hermann Southwest, which he has to put up with me. But tonight he also is the co-chair of the Hospital Ethics Committee, in which he gets involved with many difficult decisions with family and end of life. So his role will be critical. So with that as a background, let's start with a few questions. We have a few questions that we're going to ask the panel. And then towards the second half of after 7:30, quarter to 8, we'll begin to ask open questions to the audience. So if you please, we're going to pass out index cards. We'll pass that, and Steve Tamber, my co-chair, we'll pick those up and we'll ask those questions. So that's going to be the format. Okay, so let's start off by asking the panel how each of you, when discussing this, how do you think of, how would you discuss sacred aging from different perspectives? So I'm going to start off with Dr. Cole, with all of your efforts around this area. How would you approach that topic, and how would you define sacred aging from your perspective?
I'm going to try to keep this to 4 or 5 minutes. But so,
he's on the clock, folks.
so I've been writing about this paradox of physical decline and spiritual growth since I was in my 30s.
You can't hear
Sorry.
you. No. He's turning it up.
You have to just talk into it.
Yeah, talk right into it,
Is
Mike.
this better?
Yeah.
So I've been writing about this paradox of physical decline and spiritual growth since I was in my 30s. And now at 74, I'm trying to do it. Easier said than done. But actually, the last few days, I think the best way to raise our spirits is to root for the Astros. But the question is sort of like, do you have a soul? Do you have a spirit? Where is it? And I have a friend in Madison, Wisconsin that I'm sort of counseling. And he lost his wife a year ago. His health is a mess. And he's depressed. I've been talking to him every day. And I said, Alan, you have a spirit as well as a body. And he said, so yeah, where is it? I said, go to temple. Right? Go to Yom Kippur. Go to Yizkor. Right? Mourn your wife. You'll find it. Right? You find it in community. You find it in relationships. So that's the way I think about it in the context of our community. So for me, life is a spiritual journey. Right? It's a path towards wholeness, towards meaning, towards closeness to the divine, however you think of the divine. And after midlife, you know, the kids are raised, jobs are finished, you say to yourself, is this all there is? Right? You've been working so hard to do all these things, now what? And we're usually scared about this, but denial is not going to get there. And we focus on our bodies, right? I remember Sam Karf used to say when he got together with his friends, there was always an organ recital. He said, we're going to keep it to one organ. But, so to be able to grow spiritually, one of the first things you have to do is give up the illusion that you can control your body, that you can control things. No matter how hard you work out, no matter how you eat, we're frail, we do not live forever. And in the face of that, this is a scary business. So what does spiritual growth mean? I think it means learning in community to become more open-hearted, to become more loving, to care more, to find a sense of meaning in community, and to feel closer to God. However you think or don't think about God. I told my friend Alan, look, I don't care if you believe in God. Just show up at the Yizkor service for your wife, right? This is not a matter so much of belief. There's something beyond us. There's something ultimate. We don't know what it is. But I think spiritual growth gives us an option to feel connection with what's ultimately real. And so what does it mean to be sacred anyway? I love the metaphor, there's a divine spark in each one of us. Right? There's a divine spark in the person who has dementia. There's a divine spark in the person who's dying. There's a divine spark in the person who's very sick. But you have to recognize it, right? You have to be able to be in relationships with families and people who recognize the essence of you. Right? And that's not an easy thing to do. And that's part, I think, of the work of spiritual growth. So, I know I'm getting. So we're all climbing Jacob's ladder. I mean, that's my point, right? We're climbing Jacob's ladder. How are we going to get there? That's what the job is. And we don't want to take the road less taken. We want to take the road of spiritual growth and meaning. So we're joining a community of sacred aging that's been around for quite a while, and it's very exciting for me to see this happening here. There are a lot of resources available. If you give me email addresses, I'll send them to you. Dr. Sharon Ram and I are working together, doing groups on living alone. We have sacred aging groups through the Center for Spiritual Direction, and I'm available to work with people who may come in a crisis, but crisis is also an opportunity to grow. So I'll stop.
Well, that was beautiful, Dr. Cole. Thank you. Well, Dr. Warner, from your perspective as a physician and a primary care physician, how do you discuss aging with patients, and how do you help them maintain their quality of life in older age?
I think that the most important issue to discuss is exercise. I feel that my clinic, Physicians at Sugar Creek, does Walk with a Doc, where people come to the clinic and actually walk a quarter mile, half mile, whatever people feel comfortable doing with one of the physicians. Each week we kind of set that up. And I think that the data shows that the more people are moving, the more they're pushing off that what you might call that final decline. In other words, dementia is pushed off when you exercise, heart disease, diabetes, all of the different things which are going to be struggles as you age are pushed off the more that you're exercising. My Aunt Lois was in the geriatrics department at Emory for many years, and her research really showed that people in their late 70s through their late 80s who were walking and were engaged in cardio activities were able to extend quality of life further than people that weren't. And so I think that when I see people in the hospital, in the clinic, my emphasis is on what can we do to get you healthy enough so that you can get out there and keep doing the things that you want to do. And one point to make is if you're on medications which are slowing you down, a reevaluation of some of those medications can often help. We've seen so many patients come in who are falling because of medications that they've been started on, where doses could be adjusted, where medications could be adjusted. And I think that's another huge part about trying to extend positive years, positive mobility into the late 80s, whereas maybe 50 years ago we thought into the late 70s. Now we're talking late 80s, early 90s. You should still be very active. And so I think exercise and a reevaluation of what medications may be slowing you down are two very important things from my perspective as a primary care doctor.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Scott, who obviously has the privilege of doing many life cycle events, from birth, unfortunately, to funerals. And certainly from your perspective, counseling families about some of these issues from your perspective.
Well, we're always taught in our tradition that we should choose life, and each life is one that is worth living. And we spend a lot of time in community, and we do a lot of work to include all ages. In the Mishnah, we're actually taught that the age 70 is a full life, even though we often say until 120 on Me'ava Esrim. Actually, according to the Mishnah, 70 is full years. And age is a sign of wisdom. So in our tradition, we value wrinkles and gray hair and those kinds of things, even though our American culture teaches us to cover them up. In Judaism, we care. It's a sign of expertise, of wisdom, of growth, and also to know our limitations but not be defined by them. So we're very fortunate here at Congregation Beth Israel to offer a wide variety of programming, multi-generational programming, because we are so fortunate within our congregation to have 4, 5, 6, sometimes even generational families who are very present. So whatever we can do to help add to that value of life and that quality of life, bringing our services to the congregation, bringing programs in, it's all very important of how we consider them still very full members. And one of the things, although it was very challenging, the pandemic really helped us to create and sustain a very inclusive culture of attracting members. Dr. Sharon Rahm, who Dr. Tom Cole mentioned, lives in Seattle and is one of our most active members. And that's very helpful in terms of how do we make decisions with families. We can do so with things like Teams and Zoom, which are not the same as face-to-face, but certainly give that quality of feeling connected through community and family.
Thank you, Rabbi. The next question is, I think, really one of the real center points for tonight. I'd like, we'll start with the rabbi, to discuss the concept of how we honor our parents, especially as they age, how our roles change when we do need to make difficult decisions for their care and well-being. This is a so-called sandwich generation. What are our children's responsibilities to their parents as they age?
So it's a great question. And it is one that's very present on a lot of our minds as we see and are helping to counsel not only our own parents, but our friends' parents and things like that. So yes, of course, our tradition teaches kaved et avicha v'et imecha, that we should honor our mother and our father. That word kavod, honor, also can sometimes be translated a little bit as a burden, sort of a weight that we bear. And it's true that we have to do our best to honor them. It's very hard, and we're very fortunate. I see Carl Dosart, who is here, and we're very lucky to partner so often with JFS and trained social workers and physicians, of course, who help us in guiding parents to accept the things that they should not do any longer for themselves and really can't do in terms of safety and what are their limitations, but what are the opportunities that can still help them live a quality life despite illness or other sort of a disability perhaps. And it's easier, of course, when everyone is here together, but as I mentioned earlier, we're still fortunate to have the opportunity to meet and talk over Zoom. Houston, I don't have to tell you, is a challenging city if you don't have transportation. And one of the things that we face a lot with our growing, aging population is a limitation, almost sometimes a fear when it comes to technology, and that can be a very limiting force. So one of the things we like to try and do is find safe places for our individuals to live so they can thrive and continue to enjoy community and not feel so isolated and separated. It's one of our important principles we read about in Pirkei Avot, in the ethics of our fathers, that we shouldn't be separated from community. And so we want to help all of our congregants and friends be able to enjoy and experience a full life, regardless of age or circumstances.
Great. Well, now we're going to turn to Dr. Halevi. Okay? Be careful. Be ready to cut his mic off. But Dr. Levy's got an incredible background, and many of us really need to understand and become literate in some of the medical legal issues that we can take advantage of. For instance, can you discuss with us advanced directives, living wills, durable power of medical decision, out of hospital DNRs, et cetera? Can you discuss with the group what people's options are while they still can make decisions for themselves?
And I'll try to give a quick overview. The thought process for the last 45 years or so in this country has been that a competent adult gets to make decisions regarding his or her own medical care. That's kind of evolved. Many, many years ago, there was the concept of physician paternalism. Doctors went to medical school for 4 years, did residency fellowship. Doctors knew best, and doctors made the decision. That was kind of sent to the wayside with a series of court decisions starting in the 70s, Karen Quinlan, Cruzan, and a whole litany of cases. But we've kind of evolved over the last 40 years to the point that a competent adult gets to make decisions regarding his or her health care. And that is including decisions regarding end-of-life care. Just because a physician can do something doesn't mean the physician necessarily should do something. I can guarantee you, I haven't practiced medicine since June 30th in 2006, when I resigned from the faculty, but I could keep anything alive. Not necessarily anyone, but I could keep anything alive in the ICU for longer than anyone in this room would want to know. And the cost was not just economic cost, but also emotional cost to the family and cost to the patient or what's left of the patient. So everyone has the right to make decisions on what they want to do with their own end-of-life care. Texas has been remarkably progressive in one area. Texas adopted the Texas Advanced Directives Act in 1977, the first year after the Quinlan case, believe it or not. And this is a mechanism that allows a patient who has capacity to say, "Dear doctor, if I ever become either terminal, under 6 months of life, or irreversible, vegetative state and the like, we won't get into all the nuances, then I don't want heroics." And this was a mechanism that allowed people to say what they wanted to advance. You don't need a lawyer for this stuff. I am a lawyer now, but I do commercial litigation. I'm here because of my prior life. You don't need a lawyer to fill out an advance directive. In fact, there's a blueprint form that's approved by the state, which is called a directive to physicians. It's 3 pages long. You can download it from just about any website in the state. Google Texas Advance Directive Act, and you can get a form. I brought 20 tonight that I'll be glad to hand out. All you need to do is fill it out, have a discussion with your loved ones about what you want with end-of-life care, and make sure you have the proper witnessing provisions, because the legislature has certain witnessing rules on what can be done. That's the first level form, the directive to physicians. The problem with only having a directive to physicians is that a directive to physicians provides the healthcare professional with your opinion regarding end-of-life care or, God forbid, an irreversible condition. But that doesn't come up every day in the hospital or in the medical care setting. There are many, 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 many more questions that come up on a day-to-day basis, whether you're seeing the doctor in the hospital, in the clinic, etc. The other and possibly even more important form that everyone, I don't care if you're 98 or you're 18, you need to have one of these, is what's called a medical power of attorney. For the pseudo-lawyers in the room, you know there's a thing called a power of attorney. The problem with it is a regular power of attorney never has more power than the person granting it. So if you gave your spouse a regular power of attorney to sign a real estate deal, guess what? If you lose capacity, your spouse has no power under that power of attorney. A medical power of attorney is the exact opposite. The person with a medical power of attorney doesn't have any power over you as long as you have capacity. The moment you lack capacity, you got to pick who you wanted to make your decisions for you. Again, it's a boilerplate form, downloadable. I brought extra copies if you want to fill it out. Same silly witnessing rules. Now, you don't have to have a medical power of attorney. If you don't want to have a medical power of attorney, the state legislature has a default hierarchy based on the Ward and June Cleaver notion of the family. And if you happen to have the perfect Ward and June Cleaver family, then you know what? Roll with the device, with the default hierarchy. My clinical work for years was at Ben Taub and also some of our other teaching hospitals. I probably had 4 or 5 June Cleaver families during my 16 years of practice. The medical power of attorney lets you pick who you want. If it's a loving spouse, that's wonderful. My wife has my medical power of attorney. She knows what my wishes are. She's known them for many, many years. But in certain other families, the spouse might not be the right person to have the power of attorney. Only you, as in each and every one of you in this audience, can know who you would pick to make your decisions when you're not able to do so. So my strong piece of advice is that everyone needs 2 documents: the directive to physicians outlining the general principles of what you want on end-of-life care, and a medical power of attorney outlining who makes the decisions if you can't. Are they perfect? No. Will every doctor in this city honor them? We'll get into that probably later on. There's still problems with it, but you want to be in control of your own life. As Dr. Cole said, it's part of the sacred aging, expanding the spirit, being part of the community. We've all gotten to the places we are in lives with strong opinions. I'm not going to tell anyone in this room what they should do with their own end-of-life care, but we've all thought about it. And wouldn't you rather have your own wishes followed rather than the wishes of a group of doctors who don't know you?
Great advice. Sort of a follow-up to that. Anyone in the panel can talk about that. And I've obviously thought about the kind of patients that I see in the hospital are very acute and very ill. And the question always comes up to me, what does it mean to die with dignity? And is there such a thing, I hate to say that, sounds crude, is there such a thing as a good death? And can you avoid that with following the advice that Dr. Halevi mentioned? So anyone on the panel want to say, how can you die with dignity?
My first reaction is, you don't die with dignity alone. Right? You die with dignity because the people who are caring for you love you and respect you. Right? I mean, you can't be dignified by yourself and not be recognized. So that's just my first thought.
Amen.
Everybody hear what Dr. Cole said? Why don't you repeat what you said? I think Tom, why don't you repeat what you just said about...
Repeat it with the microphone.
What I just said?
Yeah, because I'm not sure everybody heard you.
How do you die with dignity? I think you cannot die with dignity by yourself. People who love you and care for you have to treat you with dignity. And that's how you can die with dignity.
Thank you. Dr. Walner, did you have a comment?
Well, and extending on what Dr. Levy said, part of a death with dignity is a death in your own terms. So if you are in the intensive care unit, being propped up by machines and unable to participate in the world around you, it's hard to see that that is a dignified life or a dignified death. And so part of the discussion that we're having here is to set up the terms in which you would say enough is enough when people are poking and prodding you. And so part of a death with dignity is the community, and part of the death with dignity is your own terms, your own opinions mattering at the end.
Rabbi?
I would add to what Dr. Halevi said, that we also talk about something in Jewish tradition known as an ethical will. So that's also a very important part of the legal aspects, which are very, very important and also on my list too of things, but also the ethical side of things. And to what Dr. Woolner said and to Dr. Cole, it's about allowing and helping guide someone into making tough decisions that's best suits them in the moment. So while treatments may be available, it's not necessarily the kind of life or the trajectory that a person may choose, and acknowledging that a choice that someone makes may not be our choice, but it would be right for them in their moment and at their time. And that we also have to feel comfortable acknowledging that death will happen for those we love and are closest to as well. So that's a very important part of that process, is that it is collaborative and communal, and that we have to be supportive, even if it's hard. And to admit that, to say it's hard to hear you say that you don't want to continue treatment. And that's where the spiritual care comes in and rabbinic care comes in, because even though medicine and treatments are available and can help prolong life, we also need to think about what is the quality of that life and how will that make someone feel.
That's very well said. So we're going to go through a couple of case scenarios, I think, to sort of hopefully highlight some of what we've discussed. So the first case is Mrs. Jones. By the way, these were based on real life experiences. And probably all of us have had cases like this. Mrs. Jones is 55 years old and has just been diagnosed with ALS. Mr. and Mrs. Jones have been married for 43 years. Oh, it's Lou Gehrig's disease, progressive neurological disease. Thank you. Okay.
It's a neurological disease. You're going to die, and it's not going to be pretty.
Thank you.
Sorry. That's the short version.
Explain a little more about what
Yeah, what happens with ALS is you begin to lose muscular control and breathing, but you still have your mind. It does not affect your mind, so you know exactly what's happening with your body. So it can be a prolonged and sometimes difficult death, as Dr. Halevi has mentioned. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Jones have been married for 43 years. They have two, huh? 34. I reversed it.
They're from Kentucky.
34 is correct, excuse me. And they have 2 children. One who lives, at least I know you're paying attention. One who lives in Denver and one who lives in Boston. So, Dr. Warner, from your perspective, you're the primary care physician for Mrs. Jones. How would you counsel her? I think we've sort of already alluded to this about what Mrs. Jones can experience over the next months to maybe a year, year and a half of her life.
Well, and in each of these cases, we're basically outlining what Dr. Halevi said. We're going to counsel to have someone to help make those decisions. Is that your child that lives all the way in Denver? Is that a good idea? I mean, what if something happens in the middle of the night and that child is unavailable when the doctors are trying to debate therapeutic options? Is that your wife? Is that your husband, who's right there with you, but may also have an emotional response when you're going into a hospital or to a clinic that may be different than the way you wanted, your last days or moments to be handled. And then we're also going to be counseling for that recommendation, that letter in which you're telling your physician and your future doctor team the way that you would want things to be managed. So in the room, of course, first we're going to just talk over the illness. But when we're faced with terminal illness, I think we have to recognize that it's really then time, if it hasn't already been dealt with, to face these issues of decision-making, these issues of how we want our last moments. On a personal note, my stepfather passed away with ALS, and so I was his medical power of decision-making, and so I went through this process, and I think he had a death with dignity because he was able to outline to everyone what he wanted as he went through this unfortunate and terminal, illness.
Anything to add, Rabbi?
I think that you think about your community and your resources are very, very important. And while we know that Houston is top-notch medical community, when I read the scenario, I talked a lot. I focused really where the children were in Denver and in Boston. And that's where these meetings over Zoom can be extremely helpful in terms of not only helping the patient, but also the spouse, and making sure that there are things that are set up and in good order. We've been through a lot of sad losses in our congregation over the past year and a half, and I'm always encouraged to hear those who lost spouses relatively suddenly say that they were in good hands or they felt prepared. So downsizing, thinking about security in the home, even accessibility, all these kinds of things, it's really never too early to start thinking about those things and helping guide the couple. What are the resources that are available through JFS or the JCC or the synagogue? And it may be that in the long run, it's better to be in Denver or in Boston, even though Houston's been home. You just never know that it may be that there's still telemedicine and the ability to help care in a lot of different places. So I think we're attached to home as a physical place, but we also need to think about a physical, what's going to be of greatest benefit, and that may mean a geographical shift.
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit. And as you might expect, Mrs. Jones dies 14 months later. And Rabbi, can you walk us through, because this comes up all the time, funeral arrangements, eulogies, and obituaries.
Sure. So one of the things we like to promote is talk about pre-planning. And one of the things we also note is that just by talking about death doesn't mean it's going to happen. Contrary to the evil eye, we acknowledge that death happens in our tradition. And part of that good death situation is having a pre-need funeral in place. So knowing, is there a plot? What are the wishes? Is there a military cemetery? Is there a funeral home? I'm very fortunate. My parents are still living and doing well, but a couple of years ago, I really forced them to help to do this. And so they're all set and things are pre-planned. Every detail has been covered. And I can't emphasize that enough. And we're very fortunate in our community to have many good funeral homes that we work with. The tradition is such that we like to plan for a funeral as soon as possible. The reality, as we know, is that it doesn't always happen. So we have Shabbat, we have holidays, we have things that prevent that from happening within 24 hours as it used to. And we want to make sure that every family member who wants to be in attendance at the funeral can. So often we wait some time, 3 days, 4 days. We don't like to wait too long, but then we start the planning. It's become sort of a norm, and I'm not really sure how or when this happened, that we do have a lot of family members speak at a funeral. It's not really the Jewish way. If it happened at a funeral, nothing wrong. It's hard to be a mourner and to also speak and present yourself in front of individuals. The clergy is there to provide that for the individual. And given that we're very fortunate, Rabbi Lyon has been here he's in his 20th year, I'm in my 19th year. We're very lucky. Cantor Feibush has been here for now a year and a half. We know our community well. And so we rely on the stories that people share and encourage them to share some things. If there are family speakers, we do like to know. It's never an open mic sort of a situation. We like to know, and we like to keep it very appropriate and help guide the family through that. So we once we meet and do an intake, it's called an intake, then the funeral arrangements are set. The most traditional funeral that we can have is to have it all at the graveside. I know it's hot or cold or rainy or snowing, we've done it all, but that is truly the most traditional. It's become practice in recent years that we often will have a private family burial followed by a memorial service here at our congregation, which is climate controlled and allows for more time to eulogize the individual, have meaningful music, and then also have a meal of condolence. And then often following that, different Shiva services or minions in the home.
Well, now, the funeral happens, the family that stays in Houston. The children and the grandchildren come in, as well as other family, for about a week. After a week, Mr. Jones is confronted with going home to an empty house. In fact, if you look at the data, we're in the midst of an epidemic of loneliness, especially among males, which was greatly accelerated by the pandemic. So Dr. Cole, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what your center offers about living alone and grief. There's also going to be some great resources that the Jewish Family Service will have at their table at the reception that I hope you'll go by and take. But why don't you tell us from the spiritual group what you offer here at the congregation?
Sure. As I said, Dr. Sharon Ram, a virtual member but very active, she and I will do a group starting in November on living alone. And it will cover many of these issues of spiritual support and actually concrete ways in which people connect with each other, including phone calls, reaching out to each other. We'll also do a group on living with chronic illness. We'll do that in the spring. And that's a hard topic too. But people actually really need to talk to each other about this. They need to listen to each other's stories. And we have found that these are very helpful kinds of groups to run. We also run a group on sacred aging. Janice, what's her last name? Rubin? Janice Rubin, yes. Janice Rubin did this for us last spring. I think she got a good turnout. I think it went really well. Like I said, I have many resources that I can email to anybody who comes and puts your email address down on a piece of paper, and I'll be glad to send them to you. And many of those were compiled by Sharon Ram as well as me. We collaborate really well. And finally, I do individual counseling. of people who come to me for any number of reasons, sometimes in grief, sometimes in loss, sometimes in sickness, sometimes in depression. And we work together to try and heal and grow their spirits and their sense of well-being and their connection to community, because the loneliness issue is horrible. People who are alone, rates of depression, rates of suicide, they're all in the toilet. So we really need to support each other, connect with each other as a congregation. I think that's pretty much it.
That's great, Dr. Cole. We're going to take one more scenario, and then we're going to get to your questions. We're going to go to about 10 or 15 after 8, and then we're going to have a reception in Wolf Tumen. Next scenario, I wish I could tell you this was rare, is a 67-year-old who has high blood pressure and developed the worst headache of his life. And he slowly drifts to become unconscious. His wife calls the EMTs. He's brought to the emergency department. He's found to have what's called a hemorrhagic stroke, which means he bleeds into the brain. And he has increased pressure. He has acute surgery to relieve the pressure. And he's initially put on a ventilator. And Mr. Smith doesn't wake up. The neurosurgeon tells the family his prognosis for any meaningful survival is extremely low. And Mr. Smith finally gets out of the ICU. He's now off the ventilator, and he has a feeding tube, but he's basically unresponsive in a vegetative state. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Smith didn't have a directive, and he didn't have a living will. He's never had these discussions with his family about end-of-life care. You think these are rare, but it's not, okay? So, Dr. Levy, from your standpoint, if you could just quickly tell us what the legal options are at this stage and the concept of do not resuscitate.
Well, the legal options are you don't know, based on the scenario, what Mr. Smith, Mr. Smith would have wanted.
Jones and Smith.
Jones and Smith. They seem to be causing all the troubles in the country. That and some dude. But the bottom line is you can't do anything about it at this point. This is a failure of not having the discussions in advance, either as a family or as healthcare professionals, et cetera. He had hypertension. He had assumed that hypertension is being treated by a physician. It would have been nice if someone had a conversation before he stroked out. It's too late now. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be done in perpetuity. There is no advance directive. We do not know what Mr. Smith-Jones would have wanted in this particular scenario. The physicians now have a responsibility of turning to the surrogate decision makers. There's no medical power of attorney, so it would be Smith-Jones's wife or spouse, if there is one. If there is no spouse, it would be reasonably available adult children. What reasonably available means in 2023 is beyond me, given the discussions on technology now and availability around the world, but that's still the language that's enshrined in the legislation. The bottom line is that the physician and healthcare team needs to identify, first step is the physician and healthcare team needs to identify the appropriate surrogate decision maker. Smith-Jones can't talk. Smith-Jones didn't talk in advance through a directive to physicians. Smith-Jones didn't identify the surrogate. We now have to figure out who the right surrogate is. And that's, you turn to the legislature, it gives the default hierarchy. The physician should turn to the appropriate person on the hierarchy and say, okay, you don't know what Smith-Jones would have wanted. We can't do what's called substituted judgment, which is the surrogate substitutes his or her judgment for the person because they knew what the person would have wanted. Now, if I stroke out right now, my wife could act on my behalf as a substituted judgment because she knows what I would want. But let's say we never had that conversation and she's still the person who's supposed to make decisions on my behalf. She can still make decisions on the best interests of the patient. And that's where the healthcare team and the family or the surrogates need to sit down, figure out what the prognosis is. You know, If it's 24 hours after an acute stroke and the neurosurgeon says there's no hope for recovery, I'm going to say get a new neurosurgeon. That's way too early. The first few hours are way too early to say no hope whatsoever. You can start saying things are looking really, really bad, but even me, who's a big proponent of futility and pulling the plug when appropriate, will tell you the first couple of hours it's too early to tell. So the first step is to make sure the healthcare team communicates what the actual prognosis is, the reasons for it, sit down once they've identified who the surrogate is, and then make the decision based on what's best for this person, based on the way the person, if you knew how the person, and a lot of times we might not have explicit discussions with individuals. If I get to an end-of-life situation and I'm in a vegetative state, I would like this particular presser, but not that one, and I'd like a pink ventilator, not a blue one, or that level of specificity. Obviously, I'm being a little ridiculous now, but we all might have had conversations. You can sit down with the family. Did you ever talk to your father or to your spouse? On the news, there have been cases in the news of this particular famous end-of-life case or that. Did your father or your spouse have any, comments about it at the time? And you can sometimes reconstruct what wishes would have been, but again, the problem with reconstructing wishes when the person is no longer cognitive is that you never know for sure. That's why filling out the little form online is so much easier. Good. And I'll pass.
Well, as unfortunately things happen, and again, this is real life, and we'll have Dr. Wellner address this in a moment. This patient has a wife and 3 children. And they all get together, and by the way, this is a patient now who's 3 weeks down the road, okay? So pretty much,
you can start making prognostic calls.
Now we can talk about prognosis, okay? But the family can't agree as to what to do, and the wife doesn't want to act unless the children also agree. And then they ask for a bioethics consult, where often Dr. Wellner gets called in to discuss it with the family. So perhaps you could give us a few insights as to your experience with dealing with, because this, by the way, this is not rare. So that's why we're discussing this.
So yeah, we come in as a bioethics committee. Usually I have 2 colleagues with me that are staff at the hospital, and we try to talk to each family member so that we better understand what they perceive that their loved one would have wanted or what they're going through. And it really emphasizes the need for everyone in this room to communicate while you're healthy, to communicate and to say what you would have wanted at the end of life, what you would have wanted in a crisis. Because often the family members basically become at odds with each other. And when we talked earlier about a death with dignity and what that meant, I think the emphasis was on community and on your loved ones gathering around and helping you, to die with dignity. And when the opposite occurs and that community is fragmented because your wishes weren't made clear, it becomes heartbreaking for the people who care for you, the people in the healthcare community and in your family members. So in this specific case, like in so many, the actual outcome is predetermined. In other words, it's very obvious 3 weeks later, and you were talking about a different case earlier where it's very obvious that that person will never be in a position to make decisions for themselves. And so it's up to the healthcare community, unfortunately, to try to bring those disparate members of the family together to try to reach, a positive decision. And it really shouldn't be. It really should be that the family has already thought this through, has already said, this is the decision maker, and the decision maker, will basically say what I would have wanted them to say.
So we're going to ask people to fill out cards and pass them to the center. And Steve, if you could collect them. I want to ask Rabbi, while we're collecting the questions, you can start, okay? So often you get called in, you're in the hospital seeing the patient, and I'm just curious from the Jewish perspective. You said that Judaism chooses life, but from the Jewish perspective at this point, how can you help the family come to some decision that they can be at peace with and move on?
Sure. So, yes, we do want to choose life, but we also look at what is that quality of life and what is the ability. We choose life so that we can perform a life of mitzvot and sacred and holy acts. And when we're no longer able to do that, then the quality of our life is significantly diminished. So the choice ultimately goes to the spouse, even if that spouse isn't necessarily the one who has the power of attorney or is helping with the advanced directives. It really is the spouse. And in the cases that I've seen, it's the adult children who have a very hard time understanding that their parent will no longer be alive in the same way. And it's often, for many of them, the first time they've seen death face to face and have had to conquer this new threshold. We're fortunate, we are lucky. We have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, that it's very commonplace. And when we see a loss of that security, it's difficult. And so truthfully, a lot of the counseling happens with the adult children being in their 40s and 50s who have yet to really face death and understand that we will be there to support them and that making this decision is acting in the most sacred and spiritual and religious way.
That's beautiful. Okay, we're now going to get to your questions. And I'm going to turn the mic over to my vice chair. You can come up here. You can still walk. Thanks, Ed.
I can walk, but I can't see. So the first question is, I think, Rabbi, this looks like one for you. What does Judaism say about assisted suicide when the prognosis is 0 with no quality of life?
So it's a great question. Thanks for bringing it up. So, and as part of the liberal and reform Jewish movement that we are in, we have a concept that we know as Dina Malchuta Dina, meaning that as a Jewish congregation here living in Texas, we have to abide by the legality of this state, of this county. But one of the things that we do help to acknowledge is a person's desire, as I said before, to discontinue a specific treatment. And when we know that that is an option, that we encourage individuals to enter hospice care, which is not assisted suicide by any stretch of the imagination, but also helps in providing comfort and care, but no extraneous measures. And I can't recommend hospice care enough, whether it's done through Houston Hospice or in the hospital, and that marks that difference between palliative care and hospice care is very important and very significant in helping an individual die on their own terms.
Thank you, Rabbi. Here's a general question, so whoever wants to jump in.
I just want to say one thing that I've learned over the years is in patients whose pain is controlled, the desire for assisted suicide goes way down. Right? So pain control is a key issue when it comes to this thing.
And that's where palliative care is very important, by the way.
What are the major issues facing aging Jews in the United States generally? And then the question becomes, are there differences in Houston specifically? Who wants to jump in on that one? We have reluctance to go for that one. Okay, we'll pass on that one then. Okay.
I don't get the question, really.
No, me either.
What kind of differences?
I'm sorry, okay. What are the major issues facing aging Jews in the United States, generally speaking, and specifically with regard to Houston, Texas?
So I can speak a little bit to that now. I understand a little bit better. I think our greatest challenge, truthfully, is the fact that we are separated so much by geography. And I think when we think about, we are not in the same sort of shtetl living that we had, where we have grandparents and aunts and uncles all in this small collective. Now, maybe in Houston we do have those who have been here for a long time, but we also have a lot of transplants who are not originally from here but have come through the medical community or oil and gas or commercial real estate or really anything. And I think that is something that's very difficult. In the work that I've done, I have these conversations very continuously with adult children who want to have their parents attend services, who want to bring services to their parents. And we're here in Meyerland and they're living in West Chase or Katy or even the Woodlands. And there's just a limit on what we can provide for them. And it's very challenging. I'm hoping that as technology becomes more prevalent in community and assisted living facilities, that the ease of which people can find us and connect with us is helpful. But I think the families and being separated by a lot is very, very challenging. Just to speak to that point, during the pandemic, there were a number of funerals that I officiated where I was besides the funeral directors, there was 2 or 3 of us standing at the gravesite, sadly, and the family was on Zoom because they just couldn't get here. So we still see that. I mean, now I'm not suggesting that families just pick up and move, but I do think there's a sense of, in the planning process of doing all of those things, of advanced directives, also to consider where's the best living situation going to be and what resources. Maybe Denver's a better option than Houston, or maybe San Antonio's a better option, or maybe Houston's the best option, but just to make sure that we're consulting all the different resources.
So we're going to take 1 or 2 more questions, and we know we probably won't get to everyone's question. So after we finish, we're going to go into Wolf Tumen for a reception. And so if you want to ask individual questions of any of the panel, that would be the place to do it. So if we don't get to your questions, I apologize. We only have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. So, Steve.
Thank you, Ed. I think this is one for you again, Rabbi. A life partner is in a long-term care facility without the sense that that person is going to be coming out of that facility. The other partner now wants to strike up a new relationship. What does Judaism say about that?
So this is a continual, a prevalent issue. I think, again, I think that we are a people that thrive in community, and it's unfair and unrealistic to think that while one partner is suffering or not even suffering, but going through an illness, I should say, and it's being well taken care of, that the other individual would just sit at home and not do anything. But I do think there are different levels. I do think there's a certain sense of a vow that's made. I think that we have to honor our ketubah, a partnership, a contract. And I think that there's appropriate time and space, and that we help guide individuals to do that. I know, and I'm sure all of the doctors and other professionals have heard a lot. When I started sitting Shiva, when I found out that my Mr. Jones was diagnosed with ALS, or after the stroke, I've been in this continual state of caring and being loving, but also acknowledging that there were things I needed to do. But that's a good conversation also to have, in terms of what are your wishes and what do you want for an individual, and at the appropriate time, it's good to carry on relationships with other individuals when it's appropriate.
Thank you, Rabbi. And the last one that we have time for, how does a family member handle the inevitable guilt when they have to say no to a big ask from an aging parent? So if an aging parent asks sure, of course. How does a family member handle the inevitable guilt which they will have when they have to say no to a big ask from an aging parent? Traveling from Hawaii to Houston, and they can't because they have children or they have jobs or other factors, and they have to say no.
Look, although we focus a lot on guilt in Judaism, it's really not our way. Our way is to get to yes. I think that, again, in consultation with doctors, I do think there are some things that you can do. I mean, an illness, a diagnosis is not an immediate death sentence. There are ways to honor, to do it in sacred ways, in spiritual ways, to have a last. I think the more challenging is one where you have to encourage an individual to stop driving. I think to me that's a much harder thing. I think traveling might be a bit easier, honestly, than driving on 610. I think also making sure that there's a person who is perhaps a little bit cognitively more aware, attend different doctor's appointments so that individual feels supported and that other individual has the opportunity to ask the right questions. So I think those are some things that are good.
Dr. Cole.
Another wonderful thing about Sam Carr, I remember when Sam chose to stop driving. They were in Michigan. He was afraid. He got close to hitting a young girl, and he stopped driving, right? Because he knew he was going to hurt somebody else. So think about this, right? Don't make it so hard for your kids. Right? My mother, it took forever for me to take away my mother's keys. Was I guilty? No. Was she pushy? Yes.
That was great. We'll carry this conversation on. So I have a few concluding remarks, and then if you'd allow the panel to get into Wolf Tumen Hall first. I've always wanted to say this, Rabbi. Please remain in your place.
We look forward to greeting everybody.
I look forward to greeting everyone. I've always been wanting to say that.
We'll bring you back on Friday.
Okay. So a few final comments. I heard about this book called Zikor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory by Rabbi Yosef Yerushalmi. I found this out from Rabbi Lyon at a Torah study class. And so I went into this. It's a great thing to look at. It offers insights into ways in which a community's past is remembered and how that memory shapes its identity and sense of continuity. It's really a wonderful book. It reflects on one's life experiences, passing down wisdom and life lessons to future generations is critical in maintaining that sense of continuity. Connection emphasizes the importance of social connections and maintaining a supportive community through support groups and other social networks. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Tom Cole in his center, and as I mentioned before, at the table in Wolf Tumen, there'll be the Jewish Family Service will offer other ways to connect, and they have some brochures, which I've looked at, so I hope you'll go by their table. So please do that at the conclusion. So I want to end with this quote from the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of the UK. Happiness is not made by what we own. It's what we share. In my experience, the people who are the happiest at the end of their life are those who have achieved a sense of peace in how they've lived. So I thank you so much for coming tonight. I know the weather cooperated. And please stay for the reception. Talk to our speakers, and I hope you found tonight actually inspiring about how much we can learn from our senior citizens and how we can continue that continuity through memory. So thank you very much for coming. We'll allow the peace cut.